What if I told you that one single battle, fought not in the heart of Rome, but on a dusty plain in the Balkans, shattered the myth of Roman invincibility forever? A clash where an emperor lost his life, tens of thousands of soldiers were cut down, and the very foundations of the empire began to crack. This wasn't just a defeat, it was the moment that barbarians stepped out of the shadows and onto the stage of history. And without it, the fall of Rome, as we know it, might never have happened. For centuries, the Roman Empire had been the undisputed superpower of the known world. Its armies marched from the sands of Africa to the misty forests of Britain. Its roads bound continents together, and its emperors proclaimed the eternal glory of Rome. But history is rarely eternal. By the late 4th century AD, Rome was no longer the unshakable force it once seemed. Cracks were forming in its mighty walls, both literal and symbolic. Political intrigue, civil wars, and economic troubles had weakened the empire's strength from within, and from beyond its borders came growing pressure from peoples Rome had long dismissed as outsiders. The so-called barbarians. The central question we're exploring today is simple, yet profound. How could an empire that once ruled the Mediterranean world be brought to its knees by wandering tribes who lacked Rome's wealth and grandeur? The answer lies in a fateful battle, the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. It wasn't just another Roman defeat. It was the beginning of the end for the Western Roman Empire. In this journey, we'll uncover the world Rome found itself, enduring its twilight years, trace the rise of the Goths from desperate refugees to warriors who would shake the empire, relive the devastating clash at Adrianople, and finally, unravel how this one encounter changed the course of Western civilization. By the end, you may see the so-called fall of Rome, not as a single event, but as a chain reaction, one that this battle ignited. By the closing decades of the 4th century, Rome was a giant standing on unsteady legs, once the beacon of strength and stability across the known world. The empire had grown too vast, too stretched, and too unstable to maintain its dominance without strain. Internally, the cracks were everywhere. Political infighting among emperors and generals weakened the very structure of government. Civil wars had sapped resources, consumed armies, and left the empire fractured in loyalty. Administrators and commanders were often more focused on their personal ambitions than the survival of the empire itself. The economy, once fueled by conquest and tribute, now sagged under the weight of endless taxation, inflation, and a shrinking population of free citizens to serve in the legions. Rome had to increasingly rely on mercenaries, many of them drawn from the same so-called barbarian tribes they once fought. This dependence bred unease, for the line between Rome's defenders and her enemies grew dangerously thin externally. The empire was encircled by restless nations. From the Rhine to the Danube, Rome's borders were under constant pressure. Once, Rome's legions stood as an impenetrable wall, a deterrent so fearsome that few dared to challenge it. But by the 4th century, the empire lacked the manpower and resources to maintain that kind of omnipresence. Military defeats, financial instability, and neglect of frontier defenses created vulnerabilities. What had been unthinkable in the days of Augustus or Trajan, the breaching of Rome's frontiers by foreign powers, was now a tangible threat. Into this fragile world came migrations of entire peoples, tribes driven by forces beyond their control. The empire found itself facing not isolated raiding parties, but entire nations on the move, desperate for survival and willing to fight for it. Rome's sense of superiority, its aura of invincibility, began to fade. The empire was still powerful, but its foundations trembled, and its enemies could see the weakness. Among the most significant of Rome's challengers were the Goths, a confederation of tribes that had migrated from the north. For decades, Their relationship with Rome had been complicated, sometimes adversarial, sometimes cooperative. Rome often used Gothic warriors as mercenaries, offering land or payment in return for their swords. Yet despite these arrangements, mistrust and cultural tension always simmered beneath the surface. The Goths were outsiders in the eyes of Rome, strong and fierce, but considered uncivilized. This uneasy partnership would become the tinder for one of the most explosive confrontations in Roman history. The late 4th century brought a crisis that pushed the Goths directly into Rome's borders. The Huns, a ferocious and fast-moving nomadic people, stormed westward from the steppes. Their advance created a ripple effect, displacing other tribes in their path. The Goths, threatened with destruction, sought refuge inside Roman territory. In 376 AD, tens of thousands of Goths, men, women, and children, crossed the Danube River, begging for protection and settlement within the empire. For Rome, this was both an opportunity and a danger. If managed well, the Goths could be integrated as allies, providing manpower and stability along the frontier. But mismanagement turned hope into disaster. The Roman officials responsible for receiving the Goths exploited their desperation. Supplies were withheld, food was sold at extortionate prices, and many Gothic families were forced into slavery. Hunger and humiliation fanned the flames of resentment. What began as a plea for asylum quickly transformed into open rebellion. Under leaders like Fritigern, the Goths organized themselves into a formidable fighting force. No longer fragmented raiders, they emerged as a disciplined and united people capable of challenging Rome on the battlefield. This was no minor border skirmish, but the rise of a new power, one that Rome had underestimated and mistreated at its peril. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the empire to its core. The climactic confrontation came in 378 AD near the city of Adrianople in Thrace. Emperor Valens, ruler of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, faced the Gothic rebellion with determination, but also with arrogance. Believing the Goths were weaker than they truly were, he made a fateful decision to engage them without waiting for reinforcements from his nephew Gratian, Emperor of the West. This haste, driven partly by pride and partly by fear of sharing glory, sealed the fate of his army. The Roman forces marched under the sweltering summer sun toward the Gothic encampment. Valens was confident. After all, Rome's legions had crushed countless foes before. Yet the battlefield was not what he expected. The Goths had positioned themselves strategically, with their wagons forming a defensive circle that protected their families and supplies. Behind this, their warriors lay in wait. Unknown to Valens, a large portion of the Gothic cavalry was absent at the start of the encounter, giving the illusion of a weaker force. Seizing this apparent advantage, the Romans attacked. But as the battle raged, the missing Gothic cavalry suddenly returned, charging into the Roman flank with devastating effect. What followed was chaos. The disciplined formations of the legions collapsed under the pressure of surprise and sheer numbers. Heat, exhaustion, and confusion spread through the Roman ranks. The Goths, fighting with ferocity born of desperation and vengeance, slaughtered their opponents in waves. Emperor Valens himself was caught in the turmoil. According to some accounts, he was mortally wounded and perished in a farmhouse set ablaze by the enemy. Whether burned alive or killed by Gothic blades, the emperor's death symbolized the magnitude of Rome's defeat. 2/3 of the Roman army was annihilated, including many of its best officers. Adrianople was not just a defeat, it was a disaster of historic proportions. For the first time since the rise of Rome, a so-called barbarian army had utterly destroyed a full-scale Roman field army. The myth of Roman invincibility was shattered before the eyes of the world. In the aftermath of Adrianople, the empire staggered like a wounded giant. Rome still possessed wealth, resources, and armies, but the psychological damage was immense. No longer could emperors claim with confidence that Rome was destined to triumph in every conflict. The loss of so many seasoned soldiers and commanders crippled the empire's ability to respond quickly to new threats. Attempts were made to negotiate with the Goths, granting them land and recognizing them as federates, semi-independent allies who served Rome in exchange for territory. This arrangement, while pragmatic, also highlighted the empire's diminished control. For the first time, barbarians were not merely subjects or mercenaries, but partners in shaping imperial policy. Yet the Goths were only the beginning. The defeat emboldened other tribes, who now saw the empire as vulnerable. Waves of migrations followed. Vandals, Franks, Alans, and others pressed against Rome's borders, some entering by force, others by negotiation. The empire's military resources were stretched thin as emperors attempted to hold back this tide. The Western Empire, weaker than its eastern counterpart, bore the brunt of these incursions. Adrianople revealed the limits of Rome's system: reliance on heavy infantry, slow bureaucratic responses, and internal divisions within leadership. Each subsequent decade saw further erosion of security and stability. Rome could still fight and sometimes win, but its aura of supremacy had been irreparably broken. The dream of eternal empire had collided with the reality of a changing world. The legacy of Adrianople reached far beyond the battlefield. It was not simply a matter of one lost battle, but the exposure of Rome's declining strength. Future generations of Romans would look back on 378 as a moment when the empire's fate turned. The defeat opened the gates, both literally and symbolically, for barbarian power to grow within Roman lands. The Goths themselves, once refugees, became major players. Under the leadership of Alaric, they would eventually march into Italy and sack the city of Rome in 410 AD, a moment that shook the ancient world and shattered centuries of Roman prestige. Adrianople demonstrated that the Roman way of war, heavy infantry legions, rigid formations, and centralized command, could be outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by more mobile, adaptive forces. It showed that Rome's enemies were no longer distant tribes but rising nations, capable of matching and even defeating imperial armies. The defeat also revealed the dangers of arrogance and miscalculation at the highest levels of leadership. Valens' decision to rush into battle without reinforcements remains a cautionary tale in military history. The consequences were not confined to the immediate loss of soldiers and an emperor. They rippled outward, weakening the empire's foundations and accelerating the processes that would culminate in the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century. For the barbarian tribes, Adrianople was a turning point in their own destiny. No longer were they seen as mere raiders or mercenaries. They were now recognized as forces to be reckoned with, shaping the political and military landscape of Europe. For Rome, the battle was both a humiliation and a revelation. It signaled the dawn of a new age, where the empire was no longer the sole master of the continent, but one power among many. Adrianople was the crack in the armor that widened into collapse, a battle that decided not only the fate of an emperor, but the trajectory of a civilization. The Battle of Adrianople was more than a clash of armies. It was a clash of eras. On one side stood the old world, the Roman Empire, proud, ancient, and burdened by its own arrogance. On the other side stood the new rising peoples, once dismissed as barbarians, now shaping the destiny of Europe. In that scorching summer of 378, the old order cracked and a new age began to dawn. The lesson of Adrianople still resonates. Power, no matter how absolute it may seem, is never eternal. Arrogance, complacency, and the mistreatment of others can bring even the greatest empire to ruin. Rome learned this the hard way, and from its ashes, a new Europe was born. If you enjoyed this journey into the world of Rome and the barbarians, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Empire Remembered, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story from history's epic past. And tell me in the comments, do you think Rome could have survived if Valens had waited for reinforcements, or was the empire already doomed to fall?